The chandeliers in the Four Seasons ballroom glowed like 1,000 captured suns, their light dripping over crystal glasses and gilded silverware as if the evening itself had been painted in wealth. The air smelled of jasmine and aged Bordeaux, polished marble echoing the soft click of designer heels. Every table was a fortress of power, CEOs, investors, and politicians seated shoulder to shoulder, their conversations weaving numbers into destiny. Yet beneath the hum of polite laughter and clinking forks there was something else, a quiet electricity, a storm crouching low, waiting for its cue. At the center of it all sat Carter Drake. 38 years old, broad-shouldered, suit tailored so sharply it seemed to slice the air around him. His eyes carried that restless fire of men who believe they own tomorrow, and his smile, perfectly practiced, was less about warmth and more about control. Carter Drake was not just another CEO, he was the man everyone wanted to impress. And he knew it. Drake Nova Technologies had turned him into a star, and tonight was his stage. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone convinced the world existed for his convenience. But arrogance has a scent, and it hung faintly in the air around him. Undetectable to most, but sharp to those who had learned to breathe through. Storm's Naomi Bennett noticed it. She noticed everything. At 26, she wore the black and white uniform of a server, moving between tables with steady grace, balancing trays with the kind of discipline that came from more than training. It came from survival. She did not carry herself like someone invisible, though the room tried to make her so. Her steps were measured, her posture unbroken, her eyes quietly scanning each detail like she was reading a map no one else could see. To Carter, she was background. To Elliot Stone, seated just a few chairs away, she was more. Elliot, the investor known as the Silent Storm, saw what others ignored. He always did. Naomi was carrying more than plates and glasses that evening. She carried her brother Eli in. Every movement, his face etched in her memory like scripture. She carried his therapy appointments, the nights she spent sewing clothes to save on expenses, the mornings she woke before dawn to prepare his breakfast and still arrive at work before most people had opened their eyes. Eli, who had cerebral palsy, depended on her strength, and Naomi never allowed herself the luxury of collapse. That discipline made her stride unwavering, even here among the polished titans of industry. The music swelled from the corner, soft jazz, elegant, unobtrusive. Yet, there was a tension underneath, a note waiting to snap. Naomi poured water into a guest glass, her hand steady as stone, and for a moment her eyes flickered across Carter Drake. He was laughing too loudly, gesturing with the kind of force that demanded attention rather than invited it. She had seen men like him before, men who mistook titles for humanity, who carried contempt in the pocket where kindness should have been. The storm had not broken yet, but the air felt heavy with its promise. A glass would soon tip, a word would soon fall, and when it did, the chandeliers would not be enough to mask the darkness it revealed. Every guest in that room thought the story of the evening was about a $200 million deal. But the real story, the one no one could yet see, was about dignity. Fragile, invisible, and infinitely more valuable than any contract spread across the table. Naomi adjusted the tray against her palm, took a slow, steady breath, and stepped toward Carter Drake's table. The storm was coming, and she, unknowingly, was about to stand at its center. Carter Drake had learned early that power was a weapon, not a gift. Born to a family of modest means in Chicago, he had clawed his way up through sheer ambition and an almost ruthless obsession with control. Every boardroom he entered, every deal he signed was another step in his self-made myth. He liked to say he didn't just build technology, he built futures, but the truth was simpler and colder. Carter built walls, walls of wealth, walls of influence, walls of superiority. To him, human value could be measured in numbers on a screen. Dignity? That was a luxury for the weak. He wore his arrogance like armor. The way he adjusted his cufflinks, the deliberate pause before he answered a question, the manner in which he looked past waitstaff as if they were shadows instead of people, these were all small declarations of his philosophy. In Carter's world, there were winners and losers. Winners demanded respect. Losers served wine. He had no time for the gray space in between. Naomi Bennett lived her life in that gray space. She had been only 7 when Elliot Stone, the silent-eyed investor whose presence tonight felt like thunder wrapped in calm, signed adoption papers that turned her life around. Before that, her childhood was filled with absence, an absent father, a mother taken too soon by illness, and the hollow spaces left behind. Elliot had given her a home, a chance at stability, and for a time the promise of dreams that seemed reachable. Naomi had been a runner in high school, her legs like fire against the wind, her name whispered by scouts offering scholarships to schools she once thought were out of reach. But life doesn't often ask permission before it reroutes your path. When her adopted mother, gentle, silver-haired, the heart of their house, died of cancer, Naomi's world tilted again. She became more than a daughter. She became a caretaker, especially for her younger brother Eli, who had cerebral palsy. Every appointment, every therapy session, every sleepless night Naomi carried. The scholarship offers faded into the background as bills piled high and responsibilities demanded her choice. She folded her running shoes and tucked them into a box marked someday, trading the sound of stadium crowds for the quiet hum of late-night shifts. It wasn't resignation, it was resolve. She refused Elliot's offer of a comfortable desk job in his empire. "I need to see how power behaves when it thinks no one is watching," she had told him. And so Naomi stepped into a world that dismissed her on sight. Restaurants, cafes, banquet halls, the invisible front lines of service. She wore her uniform like armor, each shift a lesson in patience, each interaction a study in character. She told herself that invisibility could be a kind of power. People spoke freely around those they thought didn't matter. And Naomi was always listening. On nights like this, when chandeliers sparkled and men like Carter Drake strutted in suits worth more than her annual income, Naomi's presence seemed like part of the furniture. But behind her steady eyes was a map of responsibilities that stretched far beyond this room. Eli's laughter when she helped him walk a few more steps, the memory of her mother's soft hands braiding her hair, Elliot's steady nod of faith, these were the anchors that kept her upright. And so tonight, Carter's arrogance would collide with Naomi's quiet strength. One man who believed dignity could be dismissed, and one woman who had built her entire life on protecting it. The banquet hall hummed with chatter, but beneath it all, something darker was already forming. Carter, basking in attention, had no idea that his empire teetered on the edge of something he couldn't calculate, something no algorithm or business model could prepare him for. He thought the night was his. But the night had already chosen its storm, and Naomi Bennett, steady in her steps, unknowingly stood at the fault line. The clink of crystal glasses rang like tiny bells across the ballroom, laughter rising and falling in rehearsed waves. The deal of the year was unfolding at the center table where Carter Drake held court. He leaned forward, one arm draped casually over his chair, his voice just loud enough to dominate, just sharp enough to silence. On his left, Elliot Stone listened with that infamous stillness, his eyes unblinking, his fork untouched. On Carter's right sat executives who nodded along, though their nods looked more like habit than conviction. Naomi Bennett moved quietly. Around the table, a tray balanced on her palm with the practiced elegance of someone who had learned to glide instead of walk. The weight wasn't just glass and silver. It was every bill waiting at home, every therapy appointment circled on. Her calendar, every reminder taped to the refrigerator. Yet none of that showed on her face. Her eyes stayed calm, her breath steady. She bent gracefully, pouring another glass of Bordeaux, the red wine catching the chandelier's glow like liquid fire. Carter was in the middle of a story, half boast, half threat, about how competitors feared his next product rollout. His hand cut through the air with theatrical confidence. In that same breath, his elbow nudged the edge of his own glass. The Bordeaux tipped, cascading across his sleeve in a deep crimson splash. The room froze. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The jazz band stumbled between notes, sound collapsing into silence. Naomi reacted instantly, reflex born from hundreds of nights in service. A soft towel appeared in her hand, quick but not frantic. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, calm, composed, blotting carefully at the sleeve before offering to replace the glass. Her voice carried no panic, only professionalism. She did what she had been trained to do: fix without fuss, restore without ripple. But Carter wasn't looking at the towel. His eyes burned holes into Naomi. For a man who built his empire on control, a stain on his bespoke suit wasn't just an accident, it was an insult. He adjusted his cufflinks with unnecessary force, his jaw tightening, and then the words came. "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." They landed harder than the spill. It was as if a gunshot had gone off. In the library, conversations cut mid-sentence. A chair scraped somewhere in the back. Phones tilted upward, silent but recording. The insult, heavy and jagged, hung in the air like smoke. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't let the sting show, though inside it burned. She straightened slowly, folding the towel in her hands, and stepped back half a pace. Her silence was not weakness. It was defiance. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She stood as if placing her dignity, invisible yet undeniable, right there on the table among the contracts and wine glasses. Across from Carter, Elliot Stone's fork touched the plate, then stilled. He set it down deliberately, the sound soft but heavier than any outburst. His silence filled the room more than Carter's words ever could. A young VP at Carter's side forced out a laugh, thin and hollow, hoping to stitch the air back together. But the tear had already widened. Guests at nearby tables stared, some pretending not to watch, others unable to look away. The balance in the room had shifted. Carter leaned back, annoyed at the growing tension. "Winners don't get distracted," he muttered, smoothing his sleeve as if nothing had happened. He wanted to move on, to bulldoze over the moment with talk of projections and synergy. But the room had already changed. His voice now floated, empty, stripped of authority. Naomi inhaled quietly, steadying herself. She turned to refill another guest's glass as though nothing had happened, as though she were immune to the quake that had just rippled through the room. But everyone watching could see it now, the contrast. One man's arrogance against one woman's unbroken composure. And though Carter didn't know it yet, the storm had just begun. The room did not breathe for several long seconds after Carter's words. Forks hovered above plates, eyes darted across the table, and the soft music from the corner seemed to hesitate, caught between chords. It was as if the entire ballroom had been yanked into suspension, waiting to see if the insult would be met with collapse or fire. Naomi chose neither. Her face remained unreadable, calm like water just before it boils. She folded the towel with slow precision, placed it neatly on the edge of her tray, and straightened her back. She did not defend herself. She did not apologize again. She simply stood, still, composed, untouchable. And in that silence, something more powerful than words entered the room. It was dignity. Her refusal to break made Carter's insult echo louder, bounce off the walls of crystal and marble until it became less about her and more about him. She had turned herself into a mirror, and in that mirror the guests saw Carter's reflection, ugly, arrogant, small. Carter, sensing the weight in the air, tried to snatch it back. He leaned forward, his voice lower now, dripping with disdain. "Still, learning your place, I see." His words were like another match tossed into a room already filled with smoke. Naomi did not respond. She turned, moving toward the other end of the table with steady steps, pouring water, offering bread, returning a colored pencil to a child at her mother's side. She followed the invisible map of grace she had built for herself. Elders first. Assistants before bosses, investors before hosts. She did not falter, did not look back. Every action was quiet, but each one pressed deeper into the hearts of those watching. She was the only one in the room who still knew how to keep the rhythm of dignity, Carter noticed. His jaw tightened as her unshaken poise cut through his authority. The attention he believed belonged to him had shifted. People were not watching his polished cufflinks or rehearsed pitch anymore. They were watching the woman he had tried to humiliate, and then he did something worse. As Naomi leaned forward to refill his glass, Carter's hand shot out, clamping down on her wrist. The grip was not enough to bruise, but strong enough to send a message. His breath, heavy with Bordeaux, brushed her face as he growled, "When grown men are talking, you stand still like the help you are." Gasps spread quietly around the table, sharp intakes of breath that cut through the low murmur of the crowd. Phones tilted higher now, not discreet but deliberate. This was no longer a careless slip of words. It was action, intent. Naomi lifted her gaze, steady, clear. Her dark eyes met his without flinching. "Yes, sir. I understand," she said flatly. Not in surrender, not in fear, but in the tone of someone who refused to hand him her spirit. She pulled her wrist free with a smooth, practiced motion and moved on to the next guest as though nothing had happened. But everything had happened. That seamless composure, that refusal to tremble, made the contrast undeniable. Carter with his fist and fury, Naomi with her silence and control. The real conductor of the evening's music had been revealed, and it was not the millionaire at the head of the table. It was the waitress he had tried to crush. Elliot Stone's, head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence carried the gravity of a verdict waiting to be delivered. He set down his utensils for the second time, the soft sound slicing through the tension like thunder muffled under velvet. A whisper passed from his lips to his aide's ear, barely audible yet heavy enough to change the room's course. "It's time." And with those two words, the balance of the evening shifted forever. Carter Drake hated losing control. He could feel it slipping from his grasp like sand through clenched fists. The room shifting away from him with every second. Naomi Bennett refused to break. He had built his entire empire on the performance of dominance. Voice louder, handshake firmer, suit sharper. And yet here, in a ballroom he thought belonged to him, he was being outshone by silence. The murmurs around the table scratched at his pride. He saw Elliot Stone's steady stillness, the way the old man's silence commanded more weight than all his carefully polished jargon. Worse, he saw the investors, men who usually fawned over him, now watching Naomi as if she were the center of gravity. It burned like acid in his veins. So Carter doubled down. "Now," he said, forcing a smile that looked carved from glass. "As I was saying, Drake Nova is positioned to double ROI within 18 months. Integration will be seamless, our synergy unmatched." He spoke louder than necessary, his words spilling numbers and projections into the air like cannon fire, but the audience was elsewhere. Their eyes had drifted back to Naomi, who moved quietly down the line, refilling glasses, retrieving a fallen napkin, smiling softly at the little girl whose colored pencil had rolled off the table earlier. That small smile struck harder than Carter's entire speech. Investors noticed. Elliot noticed. The phones held just above the table noticed. Carter's irritation sharpened into fury. He leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass, pretending confidence but gripping the stem too tightly. "Service here is clearly distracted," he muttered, his tone low enough to seem private, sharp enough to be heard. But then again, some people can only ever aim so high. A few guests stiffened. The young VP at his side let out another nervous laugh, thinner than the last, like thread pulled taut and ready to snap. Naomi didn't flinch. She continued moving with that same unbroken rhythm, her steps like a melody only she could hear. She had learned long ago that storms always roared loudest right before they broke, and Carter Drake was roaring. Then it happened. The moment that shattered whatever was left of the evening's fragile facade. Naomi leaned in to collect a plate, her tray balanced on her palm. Carter, unable to bear her quiet defiance any longer, reached out again. This time his fingers dug into her wrist with a grip meant not just to stop her but to own her. His voice, soaked in Bordeaux and contempt, cut across the table. "When men are talking," he hissed, "you stand still. Like the help you are." The gasp was audible this time. No more discreet glances, no more pretending not to hear. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes wide, some reaching instinctively for their phones, others staring as though they had just witnessed a taboo broken in broad daylight. Naomi lifted her eyes to his, steady, unwavering. Her voice came soft but unbent. "Yes, sir. I understand." And then, she pulled her wrist free, set the plate gently onto her tray, and continued down the table with seamless grace, pouring water for an elder, nodding kindly to an assistant, smiling faintly at the child beside her mother. The juxtaposition was undeniable. Carter's force versus Naomi's composure. One was trying to control the moment, the other was conducting it without effort. Elliot Stone set his utensils down again. For the second time, the quiet sound carried, the weight of a gavel. He turned his head slightly toward his aide. His voice, low and calm, cut through the static. "It's time." The aide slipped out through a side door, phone already in hand. No one at the table knew exactly what was being set in motion, but the shift was palpable. The balance of power had left Carter Drake's hands, and though he kept talking, spouting numbers, projections, forecasts, the words floated into nothingness. The real story of the evening was no longer about a $200 million deal. It was about how one man revealed himself in cruelty, and how one woman revealed her strength by refusing to bow. The storm was no longer waiting. It had begun. Elliot Stone had built his reputation on silence. Investors called him the silent storm because he rarely raised his voice, never wasted words, and struck only when the moment was absolute. Tonight, as Carter Drake rattled off figures about integration timelines and projected market dominance, Elliot's silence was louder than anything else in the room. He had already signaled once, when he set down his fork. He had signaled again, when he released two simple words to his aide: "It's time." Those who knew Elliot understood. When he decided the tide would turn, nothing could stop it. Around the table, Carter kept talking, his voice pushing through like a man trying to plug holes in a dam with bare hands. 18 months to double. ROI, he declared. Quarterly revenue will compound, distribution channels will... But no one was listening. Not really. The investors at the far end of the table were checking their phones under the cover of napkins, scrolling feeds where whispers had already begun to leak. A journalist, seated at a neighboring table, had caught the moment when Carter's hand gripped Naomi's wrist. That clip, 30 seconds long, was already moving from one device to another like fire spreading across dry grass. Elliot tilted his head, his eyes resting not on Carter, but on Naomi. She moved like the music hadn't stopped, pouring, serving, adjusting details others would never notice. She was unbroken, and that unbrokenness said more about her character than Carter's entire speech about leadership. Elliot had always believed small details defined people. Tonight, he had just been handed the clearest test of all. The aide returned, slipping back into the ballroom with the ease of someone used to moving invisibly. He leaned down to Elliot's ear. A brief whisper. Elliot nodded once. The die had been cast. Carter, oblivious to the undercurrent, pressed on. "Gentlemen, ladies, we are standing at the edge of a technological revolution. Those who step in now will ride the wave. Those who hesitate will be drowned by it." He smirked, glancing toward Naomi, who was quietly setting a breadbasket before a guest. "As you can see, hesitation never pays." The line fell flat. Not a chuckle, not even a polite nod. Just silence, heavy and damning. Elliot finally moved. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't tap a glass. He simply set his napkin down on the table and placed his hands together, looking directly at Carter. The air shifted instantly. Conversations at other tables faltered. Even the band in the corner softened to a whisper. "Before we talk numbers," Elliot said, his voice even, almost gentle, "I like to observe values." The sentence hit the room with the weight of a verdict. Everyone understood what he meant. Carter chuckled nervously as if to shake off the tension. Of course, Elliot. Values are important, but surely we can agree results speak for themselves. Elliot leaned back, his eyes steady, his tone quiet but unyielding. Results without values are a liability. The silence stretched like wire, pulled taut. Investors exchanged looks, subtle nods. Some shifted their chairs, aligning with Elliot without saying a word. The balance of the room had shifted. At that moment, Naomi returned to Elliot's side, refilling his glass with calm precision. He looked up at her, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened. A quiet acknowledgement passed between them. To everyone watching, it was clear. This wasn't just a waitress. She was someone Elliot Stone valued enough to notice, enough to respect. And Carter Drake, in his arrogance, had revealed himself by the way he treated her. The storm had turned. The deal was no longer about technology. It was about culture, about humanity, about dignity, and Carter was on the wrong side of it. The world outside the ballroom was already catching fire. Headlines were being drafted, tweets were multiplying, the video was spreading, and in the center of the room, Elliot Stone's silence was about to become action. The question wasn't whether Carter Drake would lose. The question was how fast the fall would come. Long before Naomi Bennett stepped into that ballroom, she had already lived through storms far heavier than spilled wine and careless cruelty. She was 7 when her life split in two. One half belonged to a childhood filled with shadows, an absent father whose promises vanished like smoke, and a mother whose soft hands worked themselves raw just to keep food on the table. The other half began the day Elliot Stone and his wife opened their door to her, offering not just a roof but something far rarer: safety. For a time, Naomi bloomed. She ran track in high school, and when her feet touched the ground, it was as though she could fly. Scouts saw it. Scholarships waited like golden tickets. Teachers whispered that she was destined for something bigger, brighter. She believed them, until life reminded her that destiny often comes with detours. When Elliot's wife, the woman Naomi had come to call Mom, was stolen by cancer, the house grew wide and empty. The laughter faded, replaced by long silences where grief settled into the walls. Naomi stepped into a role she hadn't asked for but embraced without hesitation. She became the anchor for her younger brother Eli, who struggled with cerebral palsy. At just 16, she learned to manage medication schedules, fight with insurance clerks, and cook meals that stretched further than her wallet said they should. The scholarship still came, but Eli needed her more than any dream of running ever could. Naomi folded her track shoes into a box marked someday, tucked it into her closet, and stepped into the world of double shifts and endless responsibility. Morning shifts at a cafe, afternoons at a boutique, nights at restaurants, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. The applause of a stadium had been replaced by the hum of refrigerators in the back of kitchens, by the soft thank you of customers who would never know the weight she carried home each night. Elliot, always watching quietly, offered her a comfortable position in his empire, a soft desk, steady salary, benefits that could have lifted the burden off her shoulders. Naomi smiled and shook her head. "I need to see how power behaves when it thinks no one is watching," she told him. "If I sit in comfort, I'll never know the truth." So she chose invisibility. She chose the apron and the tray, not because she lacked ambition, but because she wanted to study the places where power showed its teeth. The restaurants, the banquets, the hotels. These were the true classrooms of character. She learned who tipped out of gratitude and who withheld out of contempt. She learned who said thank you with their eyes and who looked through her as if she were made of air. Naomi memorized the smallest details. Which investor preferred sparkling water, which senator avoided salt, which CEO demanded a specific vintage of wine. She learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. To most, her skill was invisible. To Naomi, it was data, a map of how people revealed themselves when they believed the world wasn't watching. And it was in that role, apron tied, tray balanced, that she stepped into the Four Seasons that night. Not as a powerless waitress, but as a woman carrying years of storms, discipline carved by sacrifice, dignity forged in fire. So when Carter Drake called her stupid, she did not crumble. She had already walked through grief darker than his words. When he gripped her wrist, she did not tremble. She had held up her brother through nights of pain, through moments where her own strength was the only thing between him and despair. Naomi Bennett was not unshaken because she was immune. She was unshaken because life had already taught her that storms pass, but dignity, if you hold it, remains. And Elliot Stone knew it. Watching her from across the table, he saw not just his daughter but the truth of what he had always believed. Character reveals itself in quiet moments. Carter revealed his. Naomi revealed hers. The room did not yet know it, but the story had already shifted. This was no longer about Carter Drake's empire or Elliot Stone's billions. This was about the woman in black and white, steady as stone, who carried dignity like a banner, and that banner was about to change everything. The ballroom held its breath. Carter's voice was still filling the air with numbers and forecasts, but his words were weightless now, drifting like scraps of paper in a storm. The investors weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes had shifted, drawn again and again to Naomi, the young waitress who had stood taller in silence than Carter had in all his boasting. Elliot Stone knew the moment had come. For 72 years he had mastered patience, striking only when truth was undeniable. Tonight, truth was sitting right in front of him, wearing an apron and carrying herself with a grace that no insult could stain. He pushed his chair back. The sound wasn't loud, but in the fragile stillness of the room it rang like a bell. All conversation stopped. Even the band seemed to dissolve into silence. Elliot rose slowly, like a man placing a milestone in the road, steady and deliberate. "Before we continue," he said, his voice calm, yet carrying to the furthest corner, "there is someone important I want you to meet properly." The guests glanced at one another, confused. Carter forced a laugh, eager to regain footing. Of course, perhaps your counsel? Or your VP of investments?" Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the far side of the room. Naomi had just finished setting down a bread basket, her posture still flawless despite the storm swirling around her. "Naomi," Elliot said softly, beckoning. Every head turned. "The waitress?" Naomi paused, her tray balanced, unsure if this was the moment she had feared all along, the moment invisibility was stripped from her, leaving her bare before a crowd of power. But she set the tray down, untied her apron, and walked forward. Each step was deliberate, slow, her composure intact. She stopped at Elliot's side, not behind him, beside him. Elliot placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. His eyes scanned the room before resting on Carter. "This," he said, "is Naomi Bennett, my daughter. I adopted her when she was 7 years old." Gasps rippled like wind through tall grass. The revelation landed with the weight of a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. Faces shifted from disbelief to realization as the pieces locked together. The woman Carter had insulted, demeaned, and gripped by the wrist was not just any waitress. She was the daughter of the man who held the pen on a $200 million deal. Carter's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His empire of control was crumbling with terrifying speed. Elliot's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but the edges cut sharper than any blade. Naomi chose to work here not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to understand how people in power behave when they think no one important is watching. "Tonight, Carter, you've given her an answer." The room was silent, pierced only by the rapid tapping of phones under tables. Carter tried to speak, his smile stiff, brittle. "This has been misunderstood. She spilled wine on my suit, I only—" Elliot raised a hand, silencing him with nothing more than the weight of his gesture. "You said what you believed, and you did what you thought you had the right to do. No misunderstanding, only truth." The tree. Guests shifted. A chair scraped back. One investor stood quietly and left, then another. The slow, deliberate exodus spoke louder than shouting ever could. Power tonight required no speeches. It shifted through silence, through choice, through the act of standing and walking away. Carter's voice cracked as he tried to pull them back. Ladies and gentlemen, please. One mistake doesn't define. But everyone knew it wasn't one mistake. It was who he was. And Naomi Bennett, standing tall beside Elliot Stone, had become the mirror that revealed him. The deal was no longer about technology. It was no longer about numbers. Tonight, it was about values. And Carter had already lost. The hush in the UA ballroom was suffocating, heavy enough to press against skin, sharp enough to cut through even Carter Drake's relentless chatter. He stood there with a frozen smile, desperately trying to gather the fragments of control. But the shards slipped faster with every second. Naomi Bennett remained upright beside Elliot Stone. Elliot's gaze swept the table slowly, weighing every face, every nervous fidget, every phone glowing faintly under linen cloth. Then he spoke, his voice no louder than casual conversation, yet carrying the authority of a gavel striking wood. Before I buy technology, Elliot said, I observe culture. Tonight, I observed yours. The words hung in the air like smoke. No one dared shift in their seat. Carter's smirk faltered, his throat tightening as though he'd swallowed glass. Culture? Carter forced out a laugh, brittle, echoing too loudly. Surely we're not here to nitpick a service slip. We're here to make history. 200 million, Elliot. Don't tell me you're letting one small misunderstanding cloud judgment. Elliot's eyes stayed fixed, unblinking. What you call misunderstanding, I call confession. Twice tonight you revealed yourself, once with words, once with your hand. That is not a slip. That is character. Murmurs flickered through the room, the sound of investors recalculating in real time. One of them, a man known for funding bold but careful ventures, whispered to his neighbor, If arrogance runs this deep at the top, it runs through the whole company. Another leaned back, already texting his board, Not safe capital. Carter's voice cracked, desperation leaking through. You know me, Elliot. I close deals. I deliver results. Numbers don't lie. Results without values, Elliot cut in smoothly, are a liability. The sentence was quiet but devastating. It fell on the room like a hammer, reverberating in every corner. Carter flinched as though struck, and then came the exodus. One chair slid back with a scrape. A woman in a navy suit stood without a word, tucked her napkin neatly onto her plate, and walked out. Another followed, then a third. The slow march of departure was louder than any outcry, and Carter watched, frozen, as millions of dollars in future partnerships walked out the door on polished heels and leather shoes. At a side table, a senator adjusted his tie nervously, unwilling to move but clearly calculating. Investors who only moments ago had leaned toward Carter now leaned away, toward Elliot, toward Naomi. Phones buzzed, messages spread. The hashtag hadn't been written yet, but the story was already alive. Naomi stood in stillness, her chin slightly lifted. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. Carter with his hollow words, Naomi with her unshaken dignity. Elliot's final words sealed the night. He set his napkin on the table, folded neatly, as though closing a book. I will not invest $200 million into arrogance. Dignity is the foundation of every deal I make. And tonight, dignity was not in you, Carter. It was beside me. Gasps rippled again. Carter's mask cracked completely, his smile breaking into fury. This is madness, he snapped, voice too loud, too raw. One waitress, one insignificant. He stopped. The word insignificant died in his throat, because the look on the investors' faces told him the truth. Naomi Bennett wasn't insignificant. She was the most powerful person in the room because she had revealed him, and in that revelation, Carter Drake's empire began to collapse. The moment came quietly, without fanfare, without ceremony, just a sentence spoken in Elliot Stone's measured tone, as though it were any other business decision. Stone Holdings will withdraw from the Drake-Nova deal, effective immediately. Ishim. Words echoed across the ballroom like thunder muffled beneath silk. At first there was silence, stunned and absolute. Then came the whispers, sharp and contagious, spreading like cracks in glass. Guests leaned into one another, their voices urgent, almost frantic. Phones lit up under tables, fingers racing to capture what was happening in real time. Carter Drake froze. For a man who lived on control, he suddenly had none. The practiced smile on his face stiffened into something grotesque, as if carved in wax. He tried to laugh, tried to brush it aside. "Elliot, surely you can't mean that, not over—" He gestured sharply toward Naomi. "This, a service slip? A misunderstanding?" Elliot didn't move. "It's not the spill, Carter. It's the stain. Some marks are deeper than fabric. They reveal who we are." The room inhaled as one. It was subtle, but undeniable. The investors' weight had shifted. They weren't on Carter's side anymore. They weren't neutral either. They were aligned with Elliot, with Naomi, with the truth standing at the center of the storm. And then, as if on cue, the outside world intruded. A buzz of notifications vibrated across the ballroom. Guests glanced down at glowing screens. Headlines were already breaking. Stone Holdings exits $200 million deal after CEO's racist outburst in Beverly Hills. A 30-second clip, Carter's hand gripping Naomi's wrist, his words caught crisp and damning, was circulating on social media at light speed. One investor rose from his seat, shaking his head. Another followed, muttering something about reputation risk. Soon, whole groups were excusing themselves. The quiet exit of capital was louder than any applause could have been. Carter's mask shattered. "You're making a mistake," he barked, his voice booming, desperate. "This company is worth billions. One headline doesn't change that. One video doesn't erase value." Elliot finally looked at him, eyes steady as stone. "You're wrong. One headline can erase billions. One video can redefine value. Because value, Carter, isn't just numbers, it's people. And tonight you showed us how little you value them." Naomi stood silent beside him, her chin lifted, her presence unshaken. She didn't need to speak. Her composure had already written the truth into every mind in the room. The jazz band in the corner stopped playing altogether. Waiters at other tables glanced at Naomi with something close to awe. A senator quietly slipped out, already drafting his public statement. And Carter Drake, once the master of every room he entered, was now a man no one dared stand beside. Within minutes, texts fired across the city. PR teams scrambled. Stock tickers blinked downward. Partners paused contracts. A tidal wave had been unleashed, and Carter was standing at the shore with no shelter. As the ballroom emptied, the $200 million deal lay dead in the silence. A corpse no one wanted to touch. Naomi lifted her tray once more, her steps steady as she began clearing plates, as if nothing had happened, as if she were merely finishing her shift. But every eye still on her knew the truth. The waitress had just rewritten the evening, and Carter Drake, the millionaire who thought himself untouchable, had just discovered how fast a single moment could bring an empire to its knees. The night after the banquet did not end in the glow of chandeliers. It ended in the cold blue light of phones and the relentless churn of headlines. By midnight, the story was everywhere. Millionaire CEO caught on camera insulting black waitress, $200 million deal collapses. The 30-second clip had already been viewed 2 million times, slowed down, zoomed in, captioned in bold, Carter's hand clamping Naomi's wrist. His words, "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl," splashed across every screen, inescapable, undeniable. Drake Nova's PR team scrambled in a war room on the 32nd floor, huddled around glowing monitors. Drafts of statements filled the air. "We regret the incident. If offense was caused, an internal review will be conducted, each version weaker than the last, shredded by legal, rejected by PR, condemned by the tide of public outrage." One executive muttered, "The problem isn't the wording, the problem is the video." By 1 a.m, Carter Drake was pacing in his penthouse, tie yanked loose, glass of untouched bourbon sweating on the table. He dialed, barked, begged. He called board members who once admired him, sponsors who once leaned on him, journalists he thought were allies. Doors slammed with each call. Some didn't answer. Those who did spoke in clipped tones. This isn't about the deal anymore. This is about culture. You've poisoned it. At 2 a.m., the board convened an emergency call. 12 boxes glowed on a screen, faces grim, voices sharp. The chairman's words were surgical. We have an ethical failure creating systemic risk. Our options are limited. Suspension is the first step. A vote was taken. Unanimous. Carter Drake, architect of an empire, stripped of control overnight. His Slack icon grayed out. His keycard turned red. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in the small apartment she shared with Eli, her younger brother, who had been awake long past his bedtime, eyes wide with worry. You okay, sis? He asked softly, tugging at her sleeve. Naomi smiled, tucking the blanket around him. I'm okay. She didn't tell him about the flood of messages pouring into her phone. Thank you for standing tall. You reminded us what dignity looks like. My daughter says she wants to be like you. She didn't tell him that a single night had rewritten the course of her life. She just watched him close his eyes, heard the steady rhythm of his breath, and let herself believe in tomorrow. By dawn, the fallout was everywhere. Sponsors pulled. Contracts. Partnerships dissolved. One headline summed it up with brutal precision. $200 million lost in 20 minutes. Analysts predicted more to come. Commentators debated whether Drake Nova could survive. At 9 a.m., Elliot Stone arrived at his office, calm as ever, a cup of tea steaming gently beside him. He opened a new file, typed 3 words across the header, Humanity Program, Naomi Bennett. That same afternoon, Naomi walked through the glass doors of Stone Holdings for the first time, not as a server, but as director of corporate humanity. She wore a navy blazer, flats built for walking, and a heart still steady from the storm. Some whispered nepotism, others muttered experiment. But Elliot silenced them all with one quiet statement. Last night, dignity saved us $200 million. Today it will lead us forward. Naomi's desk was small, her office modest, but the authority was real. She would have a budget, direct access to the board, and the power to stop any project if dignity was at risk. Her first notes were clear. Listen, illuminate, renew. Listening sessions for every office. A dignity index published quarterly. Stop work. Authority for employees witnessing violations. She was no longer invisible. She was visible in the most dangerous, most powerful way. Across town, Carter sat alone, his penthouse eerily quiet. He scrolled through headlines that once celebrated him but now tore him apart. He had been a man who believed power was untouchable. Now he was discovering what it meant to lose it all in a single night. The empire hadn't crumbled from numbers. It had crumbled from one truth. Values always outweigh valuation. And at the heart of that truth stood Naomi Bennett, the woman he had tried to dismiss, who now carried the weight of a future he could no longer touch. The Four Seasons ballroom no longer looked like the scene of a scandal. Fresh white linen draped the tables. Candles glowed in glass cylinders. The air carried the faint warmth of jasmine and polished wood. Yet for those who had been there that night, the memory lingered like a ghost. The Bordeaux stain, the silence, the fracture of a man's empire. Now the same space had been remade into something new. A banner stretched across the stage. Operational Dignity Summit. No red carpet, no celebrities, no staged applause. The front row wasn't filled with investors or senators, but with frontline workers, janitors, receptionists, line cooks. Rosa Alvarez, the janitor who once walked home with bottles slammed on her cleaning cart, sat proudly beside a software engineer from Berlin. At the far end of the row, a young waitress from another hotel clutched her notepad, eyes wide with belief. On stage, 3 chairs waited. Elliot Stone sat in the middle, silent as always, his presence a pillar. To his right was Mara Quinn, the veteran HR strategist whose silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers. To his left was Naomi Bennett, no longer in apron and flats, but in a navy blazer and calm confidence. She stepped forward, She stepped. The audience hushed. Yesterday, Naomi began, her voice steady, carrying without strain. I was called stupid. Today, I choose to speak. Every breath in the room seemed to pause, as though the walls themselves leaned closer. Naomi didn't describe the night in detail. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew the story, had seen the video, had whispered about the fallout. Instead, she spoke of what had grown out of it. Power can silence. But leadership must listen, she said. Last night taught us that a company's value is more than numbers. It is how we treat each other when we think no one is watching. She outlined the programs that had taken root: the Dignity Index, the Stop Work Authority, the Listen, Pay, Repair framework. She spoke of Rosa's night shift, where no bottles were slammed anymore. Of Jordan, the engineer who had pulled the brake in a meeting and was thanked instead of punished. Of Anaya, the young Indian woman once cut off for her accent, now leading technical discussions because respect had been enforced as non-negotiable. Dignity is not decoration, Naomi said. It is operational. If it fails, we all fail. Applause rose, not thunderous, not forced, but long and real, swelling from the front row where the workers sat, then spilling into the rows of executives behind them. And then, almost unnoticed, at first a man in a plain gray suit stood near the back of the hall. No entourage, no flashing cameras. His once perfect smile had been stripped away, leaving behind something quieter, heavier. Carter Drake. He did not walk to the stage. He did not demand attention. He stood among the crowd, his hands clasped in front of him, listening. For the first time in years, he was not speaking, not pitching, not commanding. He was simply present. When Naomi's eyes swept across the room, she caught him there. For a moment, silence passed between them. He did not flinch away. Instead, he gave the smallest nod, not for forgiveness, not for redemption, but for acknowledgement. A man who had finally learned what power was not. Naomi returned the nod, her expression calm, unreadable. She turned back to the audience. No one, not even me, is exempt. If I fail to honor dignity, pull the brake on me too. The room rose to its feet, not in a roar, but in a collective pledge, a silent agreement stronger than applause. Later that night, when the ballroom had emptied and only staff remained stacking chairs, Naomi walked slowly across the polished floor. She brushed her hand across the fresh linen. The Bordeaux stain was gone, but she knew it had happened. And maybe that was the point. Stains don't disappear, but they remind us of what must never be repeated. At the back of the hall, Carter was lifting chairs onto a rack. He glanced up, startled when he realized she'd seen him. He gave a small bow of his head. Thank you for not letting me hide behind a pretty apology. Naomi's answer was simple. Thank you for working, not performing. No handshake followed. None was needed. When she returned home, Eli was waiting by the door, leaning on his walker, grinning. I counted 5 today, he said proudly. He stood tall, 5 whole seconds, before falling into her arms with a laugh. Naomi held him close, her eyes stinging with tears. 5 is enough, she whispered. Because in the end, that was what all of it meant. Not just $200 million lost or an empire collapsed, but 5 seconds longer that her brother could stand, 3 minutes more that a woman like Anaya could speak uninterrupted. A workplace where Rosa no longer carried other people's anger home, in her cleaning cart. The story had begun with arrogance and insult. It ended here, with dignity written into habit, into policy, into life. And as Naomi set her notebook down that night, she added one final line beneath her notes. Dignity isn't a program, it's tomorrow's shift.